Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. We want to do what I would consider our first intentionally crowdsourced podcast. As in, we're going to talk about a concept and actively request your opinion, your story, your take on what we're talking about. We have a program called Intuitive Awakening, and we have an entire community around this concept of intuitive awakening. And what we have effectively defined an intuitive awakening is a time period in either a person's life on an individual level, or what we hope will happen in the future on a macro or societal level, where a person recognizes that they prefer the dichotomy of intuition over sensing, and they prefer the learning style or the cognitive functions of introverted intuition or extroverted intuition. And this is a game changer for them. They recognize that they're wired a little differently than most other people are, and it changes their perspective and how they see, engage with life, and it answers a lot of stuff for them, and they get awakened to this idea of being an intuitive, not just having intuition, which we actually believe all people have intuition, and that bears out when you look at cognitive functions. We feel that sensors can have an intuitive awakening, that a sensor can realize that there are that intuitive part of who they are, the cognitive function that they might not, prefer. It's not at the top of their stack, but it's still an important part of who they are. And they wake up to it and recognize the importance of it. And so that's kind of how we've loosely defined intuitive awakening. And our suspicion is that there's going to be a time period coming where the sensing intuitive dichotomy in the Myers-Briggs system is going to have like a wave, almost like the introvert extrovert wave happened. But it's going to look different because there's a lot more scientific evidence right now for introversion extroversion, since that's one of the defining characteristics of the Big Five, which is right now very popular among psychologists as the preferred personality typology system.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more actual research that goes into introversion and extroversion. And since sensing and intuition is part of the Myers-Briggs system and Jungian psychology, which is considered more abstract and esoteric and not in favor with the psychological community at large, there's a lot less, there's not funding. Well, let's just say there's not funding going into seeing whether or not there's like evidence for sensing and intuition. And despite that, it feels like there's a movement happening no matter what.
Yeah.
So an intuitive awakening, we believe, is on the horizon in kind of a big way, in sort of the same way that introversion and extroversion became an awakening for people, particularly introverts. And so we think it's coming, but regardless, it does happen in individual people's lives. And what we want to talk about on this podcast is we want to talk about what we see are some of the stages of an intuitive awakening. And the reason why we want to get your feedback is we are considering adding more fidelity of content around our intuitive awakening program, and really doing a little bit of R&D around this, what it looks like when somebody has an intuitive awakening. So we're going to talk about what we see are sort of casually the stages of somebody's intuitive awakening. And then we would love for you to come to our website and leave a comment underneath this podcast to tell us what we believe, or what you felt like your stages were. If we've missed a step, if we missed a stage in your life, if we're just missing something, or if your intuitive awakening looked very different than what we're about to describe in this podcast, we want to, before the podcast even truly starts, we want to invite you to come over after you've listened to it to leave a comment so that we can start crowdsourcing what people's individual intuitive awakenings look like. And again, this is inclusive to sensors as well, if you feel you've had one.
Yeah, we want to hear your stories. I think, now this isn't the first time we've talked about intuition. We've had other podcasts talking about this idea of intuition. In fact, if you haven't heard those podcasts, let's say you're a new listener. Those are really great podcasts. I mean, of course we did them, so I think they're great. But they're really great podcasts to give you a sense of what we're actually talking about when we talk about intuition. We talk about things in those podcasts like the split, the percentage points of how many intuitives are in the world percentage-wise. And roughly, there's about a 25% of the population that is intuitive and about 75% of the population that is sensor. And so unlike the introvert-extrovert split, where it's around 50-50 approximately, this is a little bit bigger of a disparity of the population and how it's distributed. So one of the things we talk about in those podcasts is how if you're intuitive, the world is set up for the majority of the population. So the majority of the population, 75% of the people, are sensors. So the world's set up for sensors, and we liken it much like to if you were left-handed moving through a right-handed world. Most things are designed for right-handers. So if you're left-handed, when you pick up a pair of scissors or you sit down at a computer terminal or whatever you're trying to do in the world, most things are set up for people that use their right hand, their dominant hand on the right side. So that's kind of a rough approximation of what it would be like to be intuitive if you're not. So that's kind of what intuitives experience moving through the world. And the other thing we talk about too is this notion that everyone has some level of intuition in their life or in their personality type. We talk about how it's more about a degree of intuition. So there are people that are sensors, meaning that on the dichotomous level, so that 4-letter code, like for example, I'm an ENFP, that N stands for me being an intuitive, but I also have a sensor part of myself, right? I have a sensor part of myself. When you look at things like the CAR model, we talk about the cognitive function stack of a personality, or the CAR model, how we framed it with our nicknames and the way we articulate it here at Personality Hacker. You can see that everybody has an intuitive part of them and everybody has a sensor part of them. It's about where it's showing up in their personality, not that it's completely absent in their personality. So those are just a quick map, legend, cursory overview, give you a point of reference. If you're a brand new listener and you've never heard one of our podcasts before, that gives you something to be able to listen to the rest of this podcast. And then I'd recommend you go back and search intuition and intuitive on our website, personalityhacker.com, and listen to some of those podcasts because they really unpack this concept in a deeper way.
Yeah. We also define sort of the overview of what intuition is. And then in more specificity, extroverted intuition versus introverted intuition. And so that's good to have under your belt if you're going to listen to this particular podcast.
Yeah.
But regardless of whether or not you're really familiar with the cognitive functions and how those work in the CAR model or what's technically called the cognitive function stack, if you are just familiar with the dichotomies of Myers-Briggs, you'll still know that there's something very different about you when you're an intuitive because of, as Joel mentioned, you're part of a smaller percentage of the population. And as a person who's using intuition as one of your dominant or auxiliary processes, or what we call the front seat, the driver or the co-pilot, you're going to show up thinking a little different than everybody else. And you might not be able to put your finger on how. Initially, it might show up as what you might think is intelligence. Like you might think you're smarter than everybody else. And then in certain ways, other people are massively outclassing your intelligence.
It also might show up as super aware. I'm more aware than everybody else. But then people are noticing details you're not noticing.
Yeah. So it's like you can't put your finger on it. You're thinking different. You're seeing things other people aren't seeing. You're taking leaps of faith with how with your guesses, and you tend to be right. So maybe it feels like you're better at prediction, but then other people are better at prediction than you are sometimes. So it's just this thing where you can't quite put your finger on it. You just know you're different. So the first level is actually a pre-awareness. It's before you understand what this is. And there's a lot of intuitives, people who favor intuition, that go their entire lives in this phase. They live and die in pre-awareness. They know that something's been different. They might have been able to define it using other models. They might call themselves, I just tend to be bookish, or I'm very cerebral, or I was never a sporty type. I know that Robert Anton Wilson was, I'm fairly certain he was an INTJ before he's dead now, unfortunately, but I'm pretty sure he was an INTJ. And I remember listening to an interview he did right before he died, where he was trying to explain why he was interested in the things he was interested in. And he always put it down to having had polio as a kid. And so he's like, well, I had polio as a kid. And so I was never able to go play sports with the other boys. And so because I was never able to do that, then I just got really bookish. And as an INTJ, I'm like, you probably would have been bookish anyway. Like you might have still been playing sports, but you still would have had a preference for it. But he couldn't quite put his finger on why. So the etymology for him was always polio. And I think that pre-awareness usually requires people to try to create an etymology story for why they're different than other people. And they may be circling the drain, and they might get kind of close, and maybe they just give up and go, well, I guess I'm just different. It doesn't really matter. But it's that first level is the pre-awareness level, where you're trying to put your finger on something and you're trying to create a narrative to explain what is going on. Like you're trying to define what, and you're also trying to define why.
And what usually happens at this level, and we've talked about this in a podcast too, is what we call intuitive blending. it's a pre-awareness. You don't really realize how your mind is wired. You don't realize that you're using advanced pattern recognition to understand the world and make speculative logical leaps or connections where maybe it's not obvious the connections are there. And you start to realize that that's not honored in that 75% of the population. Maybe your family, maybe you're the only person in your family that sees this way, right? And you start to say, okay, I'm getting the feedback that whatever I've got going on, most of the time it's not usually honored. So I need to pretend to go ahead and be like everybody else around me. And what you do is you do what we call intuitive blending. You blend in and you pretend like you don't have this advanced pattern recognition, this intuition that comes up for you. Or you relegate it to hobbies, maybe certain passions or hobbies of yours. You compartmentalize it. You don't allow it to come out in all aspects of your life. Maybe you're into some really geeky or nerdy stuff and you channel all of your intuition into that instead of letting it come out in all of your daily life. And so I think that's really what happens here for a lot of intuitives, and they get stuck at this place. They churn here often, like Antonia said, sometimes for their entire life.
I think when sensors are in a pre-awareness place with an intuitive awakening, if that's something they choose to do, because I think that's the nice thing about being a sensor is that you can choose to go down an intuitive awakening path and open up your intuition and hone it and sort of figure out that piece of who you are, or you kind of have the luxury of being able to ignore it your whole life if you want to, and it probably won't impact you that much. But I think in the pre-awareness, the words that most sensors use, particularly SPs, I think they'll call themselves instinctive. Like I'm a really instinctive person, or I use my gut a lot. And I think for SJs, sensor judgers, they'll usually define themselves as creatives. Like I'm very creative. And that's generally what they'll talk about. That intuitive part of them as either instinctive or gut oriented or creative. But that's also pre-awareness for them. Now, then over time, if a person is fortunate enough, especially if they're grappling with this concept of what is going on here, then they can get introduced to this concept of intuition if they run into like the Myers-Briggs system or Jungian psychology or just, or
personality hacker
or whatever it is that has gotten them to a place where they recognize that there is a difference. Mm-hmm. I'm part of a group of people that's outnumbered if you are intuitive, and that's what's going on. And the world is, like we just mentioned, the world is more catering towards the bigger percentage of the population as the world tends to do. It tends to cater to whatever is the majority. And unfortunately, what happens during this time period of awakening or being sort of awoken to this concept is that because the pre-awareness time period oftentimes carries with it a sense of misunderstanding or being ill-fitted to the world or the time period. Sometimes people in the past have said that they just were born out of time. They should have been born in the future. Or a sense of having been marginalized, or people don't listen to you and they don't trust you because you're coming up with these things that aren't verifiable or they're not reliable. Then there's some bitterness that gets carried into the awakening time period. Now, the initial awakening time period of going like, oh, that's what's going on. And now I have a why and a from where. I have an etymology and I have a specific definition for what's going on for me. And initially there's a sense of, I think, great relief for intuitives that understand the difference between sensing and intuition. It's not like any other dichotomy. I remember the first time I heard somebody who was like an MBTI practitioner talking about how the sensing intuitive dichotomy is just like any other dichotomy. I remember thinking, I don't think most intuitives feel that way.
Yeah.
I think that most intuitives feel like this was a game changer for them. This describes something that they have been trying to put their finger on forever. Similar to introversion and extroversion. I think that's another very powerful dichotomy for introverts in particular. When introverts understand that their brains are actually wired differently than extroverts, that they have a different modality of thinking, and that there's actually a couple more processes they go through when they're processing information. And like it's a thing, right? Like it's an actual thing that comes with a great sense of relief for introverts. And I believe the same thing happens for intuitives. After that initial sense of relief, though, now there's all this maybe, not in every case, but maybe there's some bitterness that they've been churning within them. And now all of a sudden they have a reason why, and oh, it's the sensor's fault.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something where I think so this is actually called the intuitive awakening. When you go from this idea of pre-awareness, you have an inkling of something, but you're not sure what it is, and then you come into the awareness of it. That's what we call an intuitive awakening, when you're awakened to your intuition. And I think that you're right. I think this is the point, and this is why we're doing this podcast, is because we're speculating that a lot of intuitives and people that are sensors that have kind of an intuitive awakening as well get stuck at this part. They get stuck here, like what you're talking about, where they're like, oh, wait a second. I've been oppressed my whole life, or whatever the narrative is that comes up for you. I've been marginalized and people haven't listened to me. I was right all along. Look at this. And they start pointing to intuition and say, right here, intuition, I'm advanced pattern recognition. I know what's going on. You should have been listening to me the whole time. I know what's happening, and I'm smarter and I'm more savvy and I've got more awareness around all this stuff, everybody. And it kind of gets this like angsty, sometimes it can be a sorrowful expression of it too. Like, woe is me. I'm oppressed. I have a bad time of it because I'm intuitive. No one understands me. Will I ever have any friends? And I think if you're intuitive, I'm not picking on you, because I think all of us feel this. I think I felt this before too. I can't speak for you, Antonia, but I'm pretty sure that every intuitive goes through a lot of these same emotions, realizing that, oh, wait a second, I'm just wired differently than everybody else. And I think this is where the churn happens. And there's a lot of intuitives that stay here just like they stay in the pre-awareness level their entire lives to this awakening. And then that's it. That's the only movement forward they have in their lives. And they're stuck in the same place that they've been maybe for years.
I remember reading on our friend Jen Greneman's, she has and we interviewed her a while back on introvert problems, but she has a website called Introvert Dear. And I remember reading a comment under one of the articles posted there where somebody who was an introvert posted, all extroverts are sociopaths. I don't know if I've said this before on the podcast, but every time I think about that comment, my eyes close and I just think, really? 50% of the population is sociopathic, huh? Because that's how many extroverts there are out there. And I think that because there is pain that comes along with being misunderstood, and it's hard when a person is in pain not to project intent. I remember reading or hearing, actually it's something that you say a lot of times, Joel, especially in a business context. You'll say most things are not a people problem, they're a systems problem. And the systems problem of one of the nodes in that system being that nobody, for the most part, most people are not aware that this distinction even exists. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that people don't understand its significance. Even when they do understand that it exists, they don't really get it necessarily, the impact it has in people's lives to really understand what this distinction means for them. And so just like Gregory Bateson said, who's one of my favorite systems thinkers of all times, he said that when we don't see systems, we break them because we don't see them. And when we break systems, or when we end up sort of breaking each other based on naivety or ignorance, or, just not out of intent at all, it's so hard not to project intent onto others around it. It's so hard not to think, well, I've been oppressed and that people did that to me on purpose. And so as an intuitive, I have a right to feel bitter to sensors, or I have a right to feel upset. And then where the bitterness ends up going, unfortunately, in this phase, because this is let's pretend this is the competency model, which we've talked about in the past. Let's pretend that this is like conscious incompetence. Like you've just been aware and awakened to this concept, but you're not really sure how to navigate it yet. And so the bitterness can sometimes translate into superiority. And that's where an intuitive gets in trouble, because that feeling of superiority then gives them a hit. It gives them like an emotional satisfaction hit. And that's when they churn in this, because going to the next level of the intuitive awakening, which we'll talk about in 1 second, actually then requires a little bit of work. This was just an awareness. What's nice about this level is all it was is just you got a piece of information that was a game changer for you. You don't actually have to do anything. You just go, oh, that's what's going on. And so you get a bunch of answers to a bunch of questions, which is great.
And, not just the answers you get, but now you're made aware that there's people out there like you, that, you might have grown up in an entire family, You're the only person that thinks. I think of my friend Dan, who has like 8 brothers and sisters and 2 parents, and everybody in his family was a sensor except for him.
9 brothers and sisters. He comes from 10 kids.
10 kids.
The only intuitive.
The only intuitive in 10 kids. And I mean, can you imagine growing up in that environment as an intuitive where the way you think is just not going to be honored in the family as much? It's just not going to be the thing that you're allowed to shine with because you have so many people in the family represented that just don't think like you. So then all of a sudden you get made aware of all these answers, all these new ways of seeing yourself, and there's other people like me out there in the world that I can connect with. And maybe it's in an online forum, or maybe there's a group you've gotten together with in your hometown, or even like in some kind of industry. And now you're around people that start to think like you, and it gets addictive. It's like, wow, this is great. And I think something else that happens here, not just the churning or the superiority, but something else can be the isolation, the insular, we're intuitive group here. No one else is welcome except intuitives, and, kind of the intuitive only club type framework that comes up from this. So this is something else that can happen here. And again, we think that's a natural step in all of this. We believe that none of this is unnatural. These are phases we go through, and both of us have gone through these phases also. Except we think that there's a way to move forward now from that, from just getting into the superiority complex, or to, excluding everybody else, finding your little group of intuitives that you're just going to play with and no one else. We believe that the next phase is to move into skill development around your intuition. Start developing around your intuition and being an intuitive. Are there ways that we can start developing skills in this as a community of intuitives, and not just being so closed in on ourselves and working out all our own internal issues in this, but start to broaden the spectrum and include people that aren't intuitive back into the framework as you're building those skills. So this is a really, really important step for a lot of intuitives that are stuck here to say, how can I move now? And this is where we'd love to hear some of your stories and some of your feedback as we start to expand on some of the next 2 levels here. What does that look like? What's the story of how that plays out for different people and different types of intuitives? Because again, there's basically 2 flavors of intuition. There's an extroverted intuition and an introverted intuition. So they're going to show up a little bit differently in how they approach the world. But this skill development now is not just a raw talent you have, or not just an awareness you have, but it's starting to put practical discipline and development around the intuitive process that shows up as your strength and your understanding of the world, the way you perceive your reality. And we think that's going to be the next step for a lot of intuitives that are now awoken. They've gone through their intuitive awakening, and now they're ready to start growing themselves in their intuition.
Yeah, that second level of awareness, you don't, like I mentioned, you don't have to do anything. You just know something, and then it all opens up for you. But the reason why I think there's bitterness in there, etc., is because you don't actually have to do anything. It's just a knowing. And there's a law of diminishing returns when it comes to just knowledge and information. I mean, it's not even knowledge. I go back to a model that we've talked about before, which is called DIKW, data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And this is like information, actually. The awareness level is information. But when you move into the 3rd level, you now move into knowledge, because knowledge is applied information. Now I know how to apply it, because just information has a limitation. And if you don't do anything about it, then you don't actually understand. Well, first of all, you quickly understand the limitations. People will get to a place where just knowing they're intuitive feels like a game changer, and then all of a sudden it doesn't anymore, because it doesn't do anything for them past the relief phase. And especially if they end up going down a more dark road of bitterness, it really doesn't do anything for them. It doesn't move the needle on happiness. It doesn't move the needle on improving their lives. It was a relief, and now it's nothing. But then when you go into this 3rd level that you're talking about, Joel, when you go into the applied information, the knowledge level, now you're understanding that your intuition, it's not a skill you come with. It's a natural talent. And like you mentioned, Joel, skill has to be put over it. You actually have to develop it. It's something that must be grown. It has to be exercised like a muscle. And you're not just right. Just because you're intuitive doesn't mean your intuition is automatically right. You might be better than some other people because you use it more often. But if you don't really exercise it in the sense of pushing it to its limitations and allowing it to fail and then pushing again and improving over time and calibrating over time and allowing yourself to, to really see it as something other than a God-given right. It's more like a muscle that has to be, exercised over time. Then you really you have knowledge now. Now you know when to apply your intuition. You know which context your flavor of intuition is the most appropriate. You know that you need to develop your judging processes that complement your intuition beautifully. And the judging processes are, again, those cognitive functions that help your intuition understand maybe like where its own limitations are without a judging process or a decision-making process, and also how to temper it, how to ground it, how to have an impact to using it. There's a lot of benefits that come along with developing that judging process that is its complement. So that third level it's not information, it is knowledge, it is applied. It's that time period where you actually have to be doing. And I would argue, if you were going to look at the competency model, this is when you kind of move into conscious competence, where you recognize how it needs to be used, but it still requires work on your part. And this is where self-esteem develops for an intuitive. When they're actually putting work around it, the idea that I just am an intuitive and that makes me better is actually it's a very clear ego manifestation of insecurity. You have not developed or matured beyond the pain of the pre-awareness. And when you get to the phase where you're actually doing things about it and are actually responsible to it, that's where self-esteem starts to manifest for an intuitive.
Yeah, and this is where, this level here is where, like, for example, our Intuitive Awakening program at Personality Hacker, and a lot of the thought that goes behind the articles and the content we create around intuition, we've developed, this is where we've been doing a lot of development, is taking that awareness and moving into some skill development. So you're aware, you're awake, you've had your intuitive awakening, now you're like, okay, I'm intuitive. How do I start using that? And the Intuitive Awakening program starts walking people through that. But we think that there's more here that can be done. So the Intuitive Awakening program is a great start, and we believe that we can start moving the needle even further with your help. As we start to crowdsource this, as we start to talk about these ideas, we believe that we can all create as a community something very powerful that will contribute to the world in a positive way. And it comes down to being able to find the leverage points of how we can grow our intuition, how we can build skill, how we can develop as people. And like Antonia said, weaving that back into our personality of how we make decisions, our judging functions, and the nuance that will add into the fidelity that will give our intuition as we move forward. And we believe that that's where a lot of the work is going to be done, in recognizing you're intuitive and building these skills. And so just, I want to take a moment to pause again and say, we want you to come over to personalityhacker.com and leave us some comments and tell us your story about the awakening maybe you've had around intuition. Maybe this is the first time you've ever heard about intuition. So this is your awakening. You're like, wait, am I intuitive? And this is like a brand new thing for you. If you've been listening for a while, you probably have already had this awareness at some point, either inside Personality Hacker or outside of us, but you've had this awareness and now you're going, okay, how can I play with this element of myself a little bit better moving forward? But we believe that this is where we can, as a group, as a community, start to think about, what does this mean moving forward? Where can we put some attention and focus on growing this? And that really goes into the final kind of sketched stage here, which we're loosely calling intuitive integration. So it's basically this idea of doing a lot of skill development to the point where it becomes embodied it becomes integrated into your entire persona. You no longer have maybe some of the struggles with friendships or romance or career or your family that you once had at the awakening or even the skill development level. You've already built the skill in order to ebb and flow in a world that isn't necessarily designed for you. You're showing up completely integrated to say, hey, I'm an intuitive. I realize I live in a mostly sensor world, but there's a lot of other intuitives around me. And I'm going to completely integrate that into my personality, into my psyche, into my persona as I show up. And I'm going to actually use that and my entire embodiment of it to contribute positively to the world. Because it's our belief that the world is getting more complex as we start to move. Like, everything is getting more complex. The problems are getting more complex. Social dynamics are getting more complex. Business is getting more complex. Nation states and governments are getting more complex. There's so many more complexities to the world. that we don't have the time to verify and find reliable sources of information all the time. Sometimes we're going to have to speculate and guess and advanced pattern recognize the way forward, especially as leaders in this world. And so without intuition represented in a significant way, honed, developed, and skill-built intuition, not just random intuition from an intuitive or someone that's using it willy-nilly, but honed intuition, applied intuition that's disciplined and has built skill, we believe will help the world become a better place and not maybe slide a different direction that could be really bad for all of us.
Yeah. If you were to take this last level that we're talking about on that DIKW concept, this would be the wisdom level of DIKW, data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And the wisdom element is, if knowledge is applied information, wisdom is knowing when to use knowledge. It's the wisdom to know when this particular piece of information or knowledge is appropriate for this context. And an intuitive integration means that you won't use your intuition when you have a hammer, all the world's a nail. Sometimes your intuition isn't the right tool for the job, and you'll know that. But you will also recognize when you're fully, and of course, all of these are like processes. They're not just stages. It's not like you just pop into the next one, you've arrived. The entire stage itself has, paths and growth within it. And this final one of integration means you can tell somebody is in an integrated level of their intuition when their world around them starts to accommodate them. Like, we feel as intuitives, we so often say that this is a sensor world tailored to sensors. But when you've fully integrated your intuition, you stop seeing it like that. It's no longer a sensor world designed for sensors. You're a creator, and you create an intuitive world around you. You show up going, okay, I'm not going to try to continue to fit myself into a sensor world. And you don't even have to call it a sensor world anymore. You start to recognize there are plenty of opportunities. This is not a sensor world. This is a world filled with a lot of different personality types and a lot of different systems represented. And so it's your job to figure out how to craft a life that is right for you. And as you integrate your intuition more and more, the thing you do less and less is apologize. You stop apologizing. You stop seeing yourself at the receiving end of other people's behavior. You stop seeing yourself as a victim, and you start to truly see yourself as a creator. And you recognize, because your intuition is calibrated, you recognize the times when it's the right tool for the job and the times when maybe it's not the right tool for the job. You recognize what in your life needs to change to accommodate your intuition and what elements of your life don't need to change to accommodate your intuition. It's more embodied. It's now a lifestyle. It's a life you build around yourself as opposed to just something that is a self-identifier.
I love what you said when you said that you stopped seeing the world as a sensor world, because when you had pre-awareness as an intuitive, you listening, the time when you had pre-awareness, you didn't see the world as a sensor world or an intuitive world. You didn't see the split. And really what's interesting is as you go through these stages, pre-awareness, an intuitive awakening, an intuitive skill development, and then intuitive integration, this is how we're seeing it, kind of a loose model. When you get to that integration part, you almost loop all the way back to where you were pre-aware. You stop seeing the distinctions as clear as you did when you first were awoken. You almost go all the way back now, but you've gone through so much development, so much growth, and you've integrated it that you no longer need those distinctions as much. You start to integrate all of the aspects of life back to it. So it's not just integrating you as a person, it's also integrating your worldview of everyone else around you, and realizing that all of us, really, if you boil it down, have some level of intuition. All of us at some level have sensing. So it's this idea that we're not really dichotomous in this. It's more about the degrees to which we have this. And some people have these as strengths and some people have other strengths. So it's really interesting to see when you loop all the way back around, you're almost back where you started at the pre-awareness level of how you're moving through the world, but yet you've got so much else behind you now. You've integrated so much and you've learned so much and developed so much.
I kind of we missed the sensor travels through this model. And we talked about sensors and pre-awareness, but that time and when they call their intuitive part of themselves maybe creative streak, or that they're a very instinctive person. When they go to awakened from pre-understanding or pre-awareness to awoken, I've noticed that two things tend to happen for sensors when they get, they come onto this sort of idea. The first one is that sometimes they will say that it's almost like they denigrate intuitives. I've seen this happen in Intuitive Awakening, the community, the Facebook community we have, because we're very inclusive. We want sensors to come on, and we love for them to engage with us and remind us of the times that we're maybe getting a little too abstract, etc. But sometimes the sensors come on with a bit of an attitude themselves. Like, intuitives aren't better. Don't think you're better, intuitives. And of course, that's a response to intuitives trying to say they're better because they actually feel less than. So it's just a hamster wheel of that. But the other element, I think, is sometimes sensors wish they were intuitives because it seems so romantic.
Well, and they also beat themselves up. Like, oh, I'm not smart enough. You intuitives are having all this high-level conversation. I guess I'm not invited to the party. I don't have a voice here.
Yeah, and
of course you have a voice.
Yeah, don't think I'm not smart, right? Just because I'm a sensor. And some, I've heard some sensors say, "Can you make me intuitive?" I've actually had sensors request, "Can you make me intuitive?" And so there can be some pain for sensors at this level as well. And so the awoken time period is for sensors is when they recognize that intuition is a part of them too, and then they've got to get through whatever's going on for them, any sort of push-pull relationship they have with intuition, and to remind the intuitives that they also have intuition, that the intuitives don't have a monopoly on it. Then when they go to the skill development phase, this is when, and I personally feel for sensors that they should focus on whatever their co-pilot process is in the car model or their auxiliary process in the cognitive function stack. I almost always feel that that's the biggest bang for your buck developmentally. But once a sensor has done that, once they've really developed themselves, visiting the intuitive part of who they are and creating a balance between the sensor and the intuition part of who they are, creating a really healthy tension is their skill development, recognizing that this is something that helps facilitate them, that this is a skill that also, as long as they're not overvaluing it inside of themselves, this is a skill that feeds into their wisdom as well.
I think also at this level of skill development for sensors is you can recognize that intuitives are interacting in the world, and you can make a space for that. So maybe you have a child that's an intuitive child, and you can make space for them, or you can find ways to provide context for them to showcase their intuition or for their intuition to shine. I know we feel passionate for kids that grow up in sensor families that are intuitive to tell parents, hey, your kid's not a weirdo, your kid's not broken, they're probably just intuitive, they think differently. So if there's a way to honor that or develop some skill around honoring that, that's also something that a sensor could play with here as well.
Absolutely. And then I think for sensors, the final level for them is, and especially if they lead with sensing, but even if they don't simply lead with it, is using intuition as part of their aspiration. Mm-hmm. Understanding that the intuitive part of them is going to be whispering in their ear, and they're going to get messages from the intuitive part of them. That's why they define themselves in the pre-awareness as creative or as instinctive, because they are getting intuitive messages all the time. And recognizing that there is a way for them to integrate that into who they are as well, as an aspiration, as part of what they want to do. We have a lovely Profiler training member named Emily, who's an ESFP. And Emily teaches language. And language actually generally, not that other people cannot be into language, but language is usually the province of introverted intuition. They're the ones who usually very much excel at the concepts of language and a lot of pattern recognition around it.
In its abstract form, not necessarily knowing other languages.
Yeah, not speaking other languages, but the abstraction of language itself, exactly. And she decided to teach language, but for her, she, as an ESFP, was like, why are we teaching it in this dry way? Why can't we teach it in a more embodied way? Why can't we teach it in an active way? So she integrated her intuitive part by being fascinated with teaching language, but she did it in an active ESFP way by having it be a physical thing for her students. And her business is doing great. She teaches online courses around Spanish. And I think it's like learning Spanish with Emily. I'm sorry, Emily, if I got it wrong, if you're listening to this podcast. But we'll
put it in the links.
We'll put it in the link. But it's like she has the desire to understand the abstraction and the principles of language to teach them to others, but she does it in her own style, her own sensory style of having it be a very physical thing. And she's doing great. So I think for a sensor, getting to this level of integration is recognizing the ways that their intuition is whispering to them, the reasons why they're interested in some of the things that they might be interested in, and then allowing that aspiration to, instead of rejecting it because it feels weird. I think sometimes sensors, like if they're pre-aware, they'll hear those intuitive messages and they'll either overvalue them or they'll completely disregard them. That's oftentimes what happens in pre-awareness. But by the time you get up to integration, again, you are at wisdom. You know when to listen to these intuitive messages. You're calibrated to them. You recognize their limitations, but you also understand that they're part of your aspiration and your inspiration to do bigger things. So even sensors can go through an intuitive awakening. And as you come and tell your stories on our website, on the blog underneath this podcast, if you are a sensor that feels you've gone through an intuitive awakening, we would love to hear your story as well, because that's all part of it. It's not just an intuitive awakening for intuitives, though that is going to be the biggest demographic that we focus on. We want to hear general stories about going through all these phases. And is there a phase we missed? Was there a part of your intuitive awakening that you didn't hear us talk about that you felt was really important to you? We would love to hear your stories.
Yeah, that would be great. You can do that over at personalityhacker.com. Directly below this podcast, we've got some comment area there for our discussion to start up and build community and continue to build community around these ideas and around the podcast and around the community that's already developed. In fact, if you haven't headed over to facebook.com/personalityhacker yet, you can join our growing community of like minds there, as well as twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK. We'd love to see you represented in those two formats.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.